Hello and welcome. I'm Al Barrows, and this is UFO Disclosure, the podcast that's meant to show an average person's reaction to all the UFO, UAP news from everywhere and anywhere. Today, I have the distinct honor and pleasure of having James Bartley on as a guest. James Bartley has been researching alien abductions and the military connection to UAPs and non-human intelligences for at least 30 years. He has spent a lot of time conducting field investigations in the deserts of Southern California, Arizona, and Nevada. He specializes in research and investigations of reptilian non-human intelligences as well as military abductions. He has hosted his own show called the Bureau of Alien Human Affairs, and he has also co-facilitated support groups for both alien and military abductees. Currently, James Bartley is the host of the Cosmic Switchboard Show. This is a look at the home page of his website, and I guess that's a picture of him a few years ago. Hi, James. Thanks for being on UFO Disclosure. I really appreciate it.
The pleasure is all mine, Al. Thank you for having me, and thank you for getting my close colleague, Evie Lorgan, on your show in the recent past. That was quite a bonanza. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should explain how we came to having this podcast together. I originally started getting interested in abductions with Jim Sparks. I did a podcast on him, and I was so fascinated with that. I continued, and I found some video footage of Leah Haley. I tried to contact her, but I guess she doesn't want to do interviews right now. And of course, you have to respect her privacy. So her information wasn't available. But I did the podcast, and I pretty much fell in love with her story. And that's when I became aware of MILABs, military and alien abductions. I mean, I knew that someone like Dr. Greer was claiming that all abductions were just done by the military, not the aliens. So I had that already, in the back of my mind. But seeing Leah Haley's testimony really opened my eyes. And I went on to that, and I found some testimony from Ted Rice. And Ted Rice really kind of shocked me into enlightenment. And he mentioned hypnotic regression. And I always had my misgivings about hypnotic regressions. So I thought, he mentioned Barbara Bartholic. And then I found out that Eve Lorgan, as well as yourself, were colleagues of Barbara Bartholic. And I had the great good fortune of being able to have Eve Lorgan on my last podcast. And thankfully, you've agreed also. So it's sort of a evolving podcast that I'm having, or a series of podcasts on abductions. And who better to go to than someone that, number one, has done hypnotic regressions with Barbara Bartholic, and yourself, who's also a former colleague of Barbara Bartholic and is also an expert in MILABs. And for those of you that are listening to this, MILABs, and I tried to explain this before, but I'm sure James Bartley will explain this further, involve abduction by the aliens or non-human intelligences, and then as well as the military. So I really want to hash this out so that not only myself, but my audience understands what's going on, because it sounds so far-fetched. But when you go into testimonies like Leah Haley and Ted Rice, it really sparks your attention. So I would really love it if we could talk about Leah Haley and, first of all, your friendship with her, because I know that you knew her on a personal level, and what your experience was, because she really comes across as honest and trustworthy in her testimony on her video. I mean, really endearing. I empathized with her.
Yes, Leah is an extraordinary individual. I had the great good fortune of meeting her in the early 1990s, circa 92, 93 maybe. I was a member in good standing of the San Diego UFO Society, as was Evie Lorgan. And Leah's book had come out, Lost Was the Key.
Right.
Now, some of my friends and colleagues that were in the San Diego UFO Society had gone to the annual Eureka Springs conference in Arkansas, where Leah gave one, if not the first public presentation, one of the first. And they came back just singing her praises and talking about her story. And I immediately became intrigued because I was starting to become not only familiar with my labs, but coming to grips with the fact over time that I myself and some of my colleagues were having my lab experiences, especially as it relates to the high desert of Southern California. And I can get into some of that later, but Leah's story was compelling. I ordered her book from Greenleaf Publishing, and I read it in short order. And to me, there was a strong resonance of truth in it. And it turned out, and I won't go into names and details, but some of the perpetrators she identified and who she mentioned to me privately that were involved with abducting her and narco-hypnotizing her, drugging her, torturing her, essentially. These are individuals, one of them in particular, that's somewhat well known in our field as being interested in the UFO field, and at some level wants to give disclosure out. But in reality, the individual in question was a MyLab controller, torturer, etc., etc. That's a whole other story. I won't get into details. But getting back to Leah, I read her book, and then she came to San Diego to give a couple of lectures, and I attended both, and I got to know her. And then the next time that I'd met her was at the International UFO Congress in 92, 93 at the now demolished Showboat in Las Vegas. And what an epic conference that was. There was government spooks and agents all over the place. Never been around that many alien abductees myself. It was a very special time, very emotional too, to get around so many other people that have had similar experiences. And I got to know Leah better. And in between the time I'd seen her in San Diego and the time, fast forward to November timeframe, 92, 93, when the International Congress was taking place, I'd had my own MyLab experiences, my own harassment, black ops, skullduggery, what have you. So Leah was kind enough in her busy schedule, because everyone wanted a piece of her at the International UFO Congress, and she consented to sit down with me, and where I kind of poured out my story to her, and she gave me a sympathetic ear and a measure of understanding from someone else who endured similar things. Now, about Leah's story, and I also was good friends with Dr. Carla Turner, who was another of Barbara Bartholik's proteges. She was the first and foremost one. And then long after that came, Ted Rice, myself, Evie Lorgan, and some others. But Carla Turner came out with a book, Into the Fringe, which also detailed military abductions and deep black military skullduggery directed at her family and her friends. Carla Turner, her husband at the time, Elton Turner, a former member of the Army Security Agency, they were having military abductions and alien abductions. And that's my definition of a real MyLab. A real MyLab is an individual who has legitimate, usually lifetime, alien abduction experiences. In Leah's case, she had encounters with several different types of ETs, including a reptilian. So on the one hand, they're a legitimate alien abductee. On the other, on occasion, sometimes quite often, they get kidnapped, essentially, by deep black elements of the military, oftentimes taken to a secure facility, either above ground, underground. Some of these places that they're taken to for various purposes could, from all outward appearances, be an office building. It could be a medical clinic, whatever the case may be. And talking to Leah and reading her book, these are the salient points that jumped out at me. One, she'd had a number of experiences with several different types of ETs, beings that describe themselves as Palladians. That's how they describe themselves. And they had the appearance of Palladians. blonde-haired, blue-eyed, very fair features. And one of the things noted by many of the original contactees in the 40s, 50s, and 60s especially. And I believe that a lot of those early contactee cases need to be reevaluated because so many of the nuts and bolts types of investigators just were outright dismissive of these stories of people having contacts with beings that look quite human. And you often hear people say, "Oh, well, these beings look like us." I differ; that we look like them. If they've been, traveling the stars and having this multidimensional capability all this time, clearly it seems to me that life was seeded here. We're at the outer fringes of the galaxy, and these other beings have been around much longer. So they don't look like us; we look like them.
Right.
So at any rate, Leah had this encounter with these Palladian beings. They told her about their understanding of time, time travel, etc. She'd also had a lot of experiences with beings she described as chalky-colored creatures. So if you're familiar with the typical gray phenotype body of the appearance of these grays are kind of, as you know, kind of a generic, all-encompassing designation to describe a bunch of beings that may be gray or shades of gray, small in stature, large craniums, and usually frail of build, etc., etc. Well, these beings were, if in outline, gray looking, but they were chalky colored, as Leah described them. So
Right.
I infer that to mean white, and also in the artwork depicted in her book, they appeared to be these white, chalky colored creatures. And she had a lot of experiences with them. She also had, unfortunately, a reptilian rape encounter where she described being sexually assaulted at night by a being that had brown, leathery, scaly skin. And she described that as well. Now, what happened was one of the key elements of her story was she had been once again abducted by these chalky-colored creatures. And she developed some kind of, I wouldn't say affinity for them or a liking for them at some level. And what happened, what I'm going to describe next, which I'm sure you've heard about, kind of reinforced this feeling of sympathy and empathy for these chalky-colored creatures, despite the fact that they were her captors. I'm not going to say she had Stockholm syndrome. Many people have misgivings and certain feelings about the alien abductors, let's say. But at any rate, she was on board. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. Her and her husband were in some city, I forget which, Georgia, Atlanta, somewhere, for some kind of business, her husband's business conference. So they were staying at a hotel. She got abducted by these chalky-colored creatures, taken in a craft, and they were flying over Florida. And on board the craft, Leah happened to be looking out a porthole. She saw a beach, a sandy beach, saw the ocean. She felt like a jarring impact on the craft. And the next thing you know, she's staggering around with a terrific headache, concussed probably because she banged her head. And she's wandering around in her nightgown, barefoot, on this beach. The first thing she notices is a guy in a hazmat suit with one of the little chalky-colored creatures slung over its shoulder, part of the retrieval team. And then Leah, along with the living and dead occupants and the remains of, I'm not sure what happened to the remains of the craft. It was spirited away, the saucer, I'm sure it was. But they took Leah and some of the crew members, living and dead, out to a U.S. naval vessel offshore. Leah was made to climb this rope ladder, get to the top. She sees a Marine guard seemingly under mind control. And then she sees one of these chalky-colored creatures, and immediately her heart goes out to it. She feels empathy. It's wounded. It's not doing so well. But she was prevented by the military from comforting the chalky-colored creature. Long story short, it didn't take them long to figure out who she was and where she was supposed to be. So the military, by whatever means, and I'm satisfied, have been satisfied for some time, Deep Black elements have the means to teleport people. Deep Black military has the means to get someone from point A to point B, despite the fact that it may be quite a long distance as the crow flies. They have a means of getting people, whether it's through the underground maglevs, teleportation, whatever the case may be, At any rate, they got Leah back to the hotel in bed, and she wakes up and, not feeling so well. And it only came out in regression later with John Carpenter, and that was a whole other story itself. John Carpenter was the director of MUFON's Alien Abductions division, if you will. And he'd amassed quite a database of personal details of the experiences of a number of alien abductees, as well as personal contact information, biographical information. And a lot of that information, if not all of it, wound up with...
James, if I can
yes.
just interject, and we can get right back to John Carpenter, just to follow the narrative for my audience. When Leah woke up with a headache, it was as a result of a directed energy weapon, wasn't it?
Yes.
The military
Yes.
shot down the craft that she
Yes.
was in. I just wanted to stick that in because that's a critical part of that story.
It's a critical thing. I apologize for digressing. I was jumping ahead of myself. There was a directed energy weapon at Eglin Air Force Base on the reservation, and it was used to bring down the craft Leah was on board. Wasn't the first time that happened, wasn't the last time. Similar situations occurred Mauritius Bay, Long Island, perhaps South Haven Park, Long Island, when alien craft were brought down by directed energy weapons. So these things have happened before, and probably since. So she was brought down by this directed energy weapon, and she was recovered by the retrieval team, wound up back at her hotel. Now, John Carpenter regressed her, and the story came out. Now, where John Carpenter and Leah had some disagreements about this later was that John Carpenter was going around telling certain people that, no, Leah didn't have any MILAB experiences. This thing that she's talking about, being shot down in a craft and being recovered along with the living and dead occupants, that didn't happen either. And so that kind of drew Leah's ire because John Carpenter had regressed her. That story had come out. So when Leah confronted John Carpenter, he pled ignorance. I don't know what happened. Must be some misunderstanding. And Leah, who's very plain spoken, very, could be very blunt when she wanted to. She had that fiery Southern temperament.
Yeah.
Said, no, that's, you know what happened. You know I was aggressed. You know that this happened to me, right? And just a little digression to John Carpenter and MUFON and NIDS, National Investigations Discovery Sciences, whatever they're, noetic, I forget the term, but they're connected with the Bigelow Foundation, which is connected with the CIA. Well, anyway, a lot, if not all, of that alien abductee database wind up going through NIDS. From there, it wound up going to the Bigelow Foundation, and probably from there to the CIA. And John Carpenter, being the director of MUFON's Alien Abduction Research Division, was responsible for that. Of course he was. So there was a lot of controversy about that whole issue, about leaking that huge hemorrhage of personal information to NIDS, thence to Bigelow, thence to the CIA. So anyway, getting back to Leah, she confronted Carpenter about that, and she had a number of other MILAB experiences where the military would land on her property. She lived kind of in a homestead in rural Mississippi or Alabama, I can't remember, I think Mississippi. And she was abducted at gunpoint, put on a helicopter, and this is just one example of many, taken to an Air Force base where she was drugged, debriefed, interrogated, and there were a number of occasions when Leah said that they'd stuck needles into her neck, needles into her arm, and she was harshly interrogated by some of these military personnel. So I firmly believe that Leah was not only a legitimate alien abductee, but she was a legitimate MILAB. Now, what had happened, there was seemingly a friendly spook that was, I'm trying to remember if Leah told me this in confidence. So let's just say that over time, there were efforts, it seemed to me, to make Leah believe that this was all military. And she was starting to waver in that direction, okay? And I'm familiar with the fluff put out by Dr. Stephen Greer and others that there are no hostile aliens, that anyone who reports a hostile alien abduction they're just reporting a military abduction in the guise of an alien abduction, right? So, and there's another aspect too where there is some degree of a fudge factor because a number of us, Leah included, there were times when we'd be abducted, made to think we're being abducted by aliens, but really it was deep black elements in the military. It was almost as if they were testing the waters, seeing if we can tell the difference or not. But, for people like us that have had alien abductions and military abductions, we stand a more likely chance of being able to differentiate between the two. In Leah's case, she was lined up. There were several lines of presumably other MILABs and abductees in this underground facility somewhere, presumably an underground facility. And there was a short gray being standing there before her. Now, Leah had momentarily come to a state of semi-consciousness, semi-awareness, and noticed the stitching holding together the black eyepieces of this creature.
Right.
And she immediately recognized this is just a child or a small person inside this costume. This is not a real gray. So it's an example of an abductee being able to differentiate between, and this happened to me, happened to a number of other people, something similar, okay? But it doesn't take away from the fact that there are countless people around the world have been generationally being abducted by one or more groups of aliens. Bottom line fact. And the military, they seem to have an awareness and understanding of the genetic profile of these alien abductees. Also, within the genetic profile and the morphic resonance field, what Dr. Rupert Sheldrake refers to as the M field, there are these latent, innate metaphysical capabilities that many alien abductees, who are many of them naturally psychic, and also when they are abducted by aliens and in an alien environment, for whatever reason, energetically, whatever the case may be, their abilities may be enhanced for the time they are with the aliens, to the point where they can operate alien technology, read alien script, perform telekinesis, do other things of a metaphysical nature. Point being is that not only are these people being kidnapped and debriefed and asked what they know about this, that, or the other alien group, a great many MILABs have been trained by deep black elements of the military in what amounts to paramilitary skills, survival skills, foraging skills, weapons training, paramilitary training, et cetera, et cetera. And they're trained and they're tasked in operations, and they're also used astrally as astral operators. We've known for some time that certain alien races, and definitely deep black elements in the military, have the means to astrally abduct people. So it's not just physical abductions that the aliens and deep black military are perpetrating upon citizens, civilians. They're able to abduct them astrally and use the astral bodies as essentially astral operators, astral spies. And they can be utilized, some of these MILABs, to conduct remote viewing, et cetera, et cetera. So it runs the gamut, the different things that these MILABs are tasked with doing. So you wanted to interject, Al?
Yeah, I was curious as to why the military would do something like that. I mean, I understand the military's interest in abductees and people with psychic powers. Other than Dr. Greer's explanation, I don't understand why the military would be pretending to be aliens and abducting people. You know what I mean? It would just confuse the whole issue. Or is it that they just want to get their hands on these people and conduct tests? Is that why they're masquerading as aliens? Because for me, the military had access to Leah Haley. I mean, she was tutoring in an Air Force base.
Yes,
they had
that's right.
access to her, and I thought that was more than convenient. And as you've had personal experience yourself, I'm sure that you'll share if you feel like it, but what's your feeling on that? Because I can't wrap my head around why would the military be masquerading as aliens?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that you hear so often about Project Bluebeam, this impending fake alien invasion. I'm of the belief that the PSYOP, the deception operation itself, is Project Bluebeam. this planet has been under the thrall of an alien force since time immemorial. The reptilian overlordship, there are other reptilian type beings like the Draco, various other beings have essentially been farming the human race through a long-term process of genetic hybridization, which is the fundamental plank of this whole control system. They've managed to create these so-called elite bloodlines who essentially serve as the hybrid plantation managers of this planet, which is why at the deepest, darkest levels, so many of them are into human sacrifice, ritualistic, all kinds of stuff, because they're not quite human. They're reptilian human hybrids, many of them, with all that that implies. So, as far as I'm concerned, the notion that there's going to be a fake alien invasion, that's a red herring. The invasion occurred long ago. We are in a reptilian alien sphere of influence and have been for a long time. Where the confusion lay, and I was of the belief for some time that the alien activity was going to increase by many orders of magnitude, and we're beginning to see that now, because what they've done with this very prevalent Project Bluebeam disinfo meme, many of those people, and this is a large swath of the aware, awake population, many members of the so-called truth community have bought into the Project Bluebeam. There are no aliens. It's all just going to be holograms and a fake alien invasion to take over the world. And look how prevalent that theme is. Every time now there is any kind of an alien activity, whether it's a kid reporting aliens in a backyard in Las Vegas, the Miami Mall incident, I believe absolutely something happened there, that there probably were aliens and non-human beings that scared the heck out of those people. Now, whenever anything of an alien nature pops up, a new video, whatever the case may be, the first thing you hear from the gallery is all this chirping about Project Bluebeam, and that was intentional. That was a classic with these people who claim to know so much about psyops and disinformation. They don't know the first thing about the subject, quite frankly. They never studied all the deception operations that came out of World War II, et cetera, et cetera. So they wouldn't know the first thing about the subject. But there they are, endlessly repeating this nonsense about aliens don't exist. There's only demons. There's only fallen angels. Alex Jones is now saying Roswell didn't happen, right? This is all nonsense. And what they're doing is they're detracting from the fact that we are under alien control. So I want to get that point out. If they ever, I can't really make a determination on the motives of trying to make selected abductees think that they're seeing aliens when they're not really, right? Have there been, a lot of misidentifications? See, another fallacy is the notion that all triangular craft of necessity are man-made. That's nonsense. The triangular aeroform is a very common aeroform platform throughout the multiverse, not just the universe. There are many different spacefaring civilizations that utilize craft that are triangular in shape. The humans just happen to be, Johnny-come-latelys in that regard. So that's another example of where people will see a photo or video of a triangular craft and automatically assume, oh, that's a man-made craft. Well, I've seen both. I've seen alien craft and I've seen man-made triangular craft, and I can tell the difference, right? So point being is that this military that we're talking about, this deep black military, is in itself, in all likelihood, my estimation, is under control of these different oppressive, hostile alien groups, reptilians, and other beings. Because in some of these underground facilities, and in some of these underground facilities, this may upset some of your viewers and listeners, but there are what amounts to underground processing plants where humans are being harvested and farmed essentially by these non-human beings of various stripes, mostly reptilians, but also other beings, greys, what have you. And in some of those facilities where this is going on, there are human personnel there, human military, human security. So they're very cognizant, they're very aware of all the depredations being meted out to the human race. They're in cahoots with this. And there have been times when people have been taken on board craft or taken to an installation, many times actually. And in some places, this goes on a daily basis, where eyewitnesses, my labs in our example, see humans and non-humans working in unison at the same facility, same installations at the same time, the same place.
I'm sorry. I'm glad that you brought up human farming because I was about to transition into Ted Rice, how my coverage of Ted Rice's story opened my eyes to the fact that possibly ETs are farming humans. Jim Sparks also mentioned that, by the way. And then when I spoke with Eve Lorgan, she opened my eyes to the fact that they could be just farming our energy as well. So we seem to be a big resource in that sense. And the majority of us are totally ignorant of it, which is very convenient. I also came across Leonard H. Stringfield's work on crash retrievals. He wrote about a 1972 event on the border of
Cambodia.
Cambodia, yeah, where a special ops team went out to investigate some group that, well, they knew that there was something tapping into their comms unit. All their communication was being tapped into. They sent a small crack unit into the area, and they were taken aback because not only did they see a large glowing craft that made them sick and disoriented, but they saw humanoid beings carting human body parts of various races, black, white, Asian body parts, into containers, putting it onto the ship. And if I remember correctly, they fired upon these humanoids, and to no avail. I think maybe they killed one because it got shot in the head, but in return, they all became ill or died from some sort of special weaponry that they returned fire with. So put all that together with Ted Rice's testimony. I mean, it's pretty scary. This is stuff that you have to gently weed into common knowledge, which is why I'm coming to you. You naturally can't just come out right and shock the average American with this sort of thing. You have to educate them, I think, slowly so that they can comprehend how something like this can actually be going on without anyone realizing it.
Well, when you get a moment, I'd recommend that if you haven't already done so, interview Pierre Sabak, because in his books, The Holographic Culture and The Murder of Reality, he goes into the etymological, philological roots of words and their connections. Ancient Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, etc. And he's absolutely proven, to my satisfaction, because he lays it all out in his books, that all these references to boats, to round objects, to shining objects, to the Watchers, to the Archons, they refer, when you track it back to its source of the original language, to reptilian beings, lizard-like beings, snake-like beings, aliens of various stripes, but also celestial flying objects. Okay, so this notion that the term flying saucer only came into being in after Kenneth Arnold had his sighting, that the concept of outer space, of rocket ships, of Buck Rogers, what have you, only came into being in the early 20th century, that's nonsense. It's embedded in our language of these beings being here all along, controlling humanity. And I would go so far as to say that up until the recent past, it's the aliens themselves that have been maintaining the cover-up because of this planetary control grid they're setting up. So getting back to Leonard Stringfield, to me, Stringfield is on the Mount Olympus of UFO, Mount Rushmore, right? But also, in my view, he's like in the pantheon of the greats, Mount Olympus, if you will. He is up there. And not only this, not many, oh, please, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that he was a soldier himself, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a member of the 5th Air Force in the Pacific in World War II under the command of General George Kenney, who later became Strategic Air Commander, and actually it was Kenney who was in command of Strategic Air Command at the time of the crash retrievals prior to Roswell. And Leonard Stringfield was a 5th Air Force intelligence officer, served in New Guinea and the Philippines in World War II, and on his way towards Okinawa because the Americans invaded Okinawa, April 1945, he and the other members of the transport plane who were at witnessed, if memory serves, 3 large glowing objects that paced their airplane for a certain period of time. That's where he became interested. in the subject of UFOs. Also, he may have heard, being an intelligence officer, all the alien activity, all the UFO activity in the Solomon Islands group. To this day, that it's a UFO hotspot. Like his counterparts in the 8th Air Force, 15th Air Force, and the European Theater of Operations, they were aware of so-called, not just lights and orbs and Foo Fighters, so-called, but actual structured craft. So there were elements of the military intelligence community, certainly the deep black elements, that already knew about the alien existence, presence in World War II. So Stringfield wrote a book, Situation Red, The Great UFO Siege of 1973, one of his books. And in it, near the end of the book, he describes an account by an eyewitness who reported seeing what seemed to be an alien cadaver, at any rate a non-human cadaver, in a glass tube in some secure part of a museum or some other kind of similar place. When he included that in his book, it led to a veritable avalanche of first-hand witnesses who began writing to him and sharing their stories about either taking part in a retrieval of a crashed alien craft and seeing alien bodies, or conversely, seeing recovered alien craft or alien cadavers at secure facilities. One of the facilities frequently mentioned was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Foreign Technology Division, Air Material Command. So he got a veritable avalanche of all these responses, to the point by the time 1979 rolled around, Stringfield already had 50 separate first-hand witnesses to various aspects of the crash retrieval back engineering operation. And we know, thanks to the work of the Woods, Ryan Wood and Robert Wood, and in fact the Woods are coming out with a new book talking about over 100 different crash retrievals. And if people balk at that number of the amount of crash retrievals, I would remind them of the continuous ongoing presence, alien presence here on Earth. Some of these alien races have long established underground, undersea bases here, to the point that it's a question of semantics whether they're really alien. I mean, they may be alien in culture, outlook, mentality, technology, but as far as, they might as well be honorary Earthlings if they've been here that long, conducting these operations, genetic engineering, essentially hybridization, to change the human race into a variant that fits the needs, suits the needs of these alien controllers. So I should point that out. So 79 rolls around, Stringfield's already got 50 first-hand witnesses. And you also look at the alien bodies, just at one facility alone, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. By the time 1966 rolled around, according to Stringfield, if memory serves, I may be wrong about this, but if memory serves, one of its sources told him by the time 66 rolled around, there were already 30 different alien bodies at Wright-Pat alone. I've interviewed William English on my show. He was part of it. This is tracking back to the incident in Cambodia. Okay, there's two incidents that people sometimes conflate. There was William English's team. He led a special forces team into Cambodia to what they thought was going to be a B-52 crash site. That there was a report that a UFO or something was messing with a B-52 on an arc light mission probably, and that it crashed in the jungle. And then William English and the special forces team was tasked to go in, secure the crash site. What they found was a perfectly intact B-52 landed in a clearing, and the crew members were still strapped to their seats, but they had been mutilated. And we're familiar with the cattle mutilations. The late great Bob Pratt, who spent a lot of time in Brazil and Latin America, researching with the great Brazilian investigators about human mutilations, about alien attacks on humans. This has been going on long before Peru, okay, which again, it's written off as all blue beam now. But Stringfield had talked to different witnesses. Okay, that was William English's experience, where they went there and they found these bodies strapped into place in the B-52, and they were mutilated in ways very similar to the cattle mutilations, the mouths and the rectums cored out, all that stuff. What happened in the other incident in Cambodia was apparently, and I was listening to an interview with John Lear about this on the Coast to Coast show, and he talked about how a SOG team, Special Operations Group, had been tasked, like you said, going into Cambodia April of that year, 72, memory serves. They came into a clearing, and there was a spear-shaped, globe-shaped craft. Now, Barbara Bartley used to always talk about the globe-shaped, spear-shaped craft as being what she called soul repositories. Soul repositories, because sometimes some of those crew members in the craft, the globe-shaped craft, they store essentially souls that have exited the body through some kind of natural disaster, carnage, war, whatever the case may be. The Battle of Chattanooga campaign in November 1863, there was a large globe-shaped craft sighted for many days prior to the battle, which some of the federal troops jokingly referred to as Hooker's balloon. General Joseph Hooker was one of the commanders there. No, it was in all likelihood one of these globe-shaped craft, which I saw in the early 1980s. I was laying on my back in a park, and I saw one of these globe-shaped craft create a cloud bank for itself to hide in. Okay, so I know these globe-shaped craft are real. Another friend of mine, Helga Morrow, had a near-death experience, abducted, taken on board one of these globe-shaped craft, and was shown by this demonic-looking entity, that they keep all these demented souls in that particular craft. So getting back to the story, the SOG team goes in there to Cambodia. They start to feel the ill effects of the close proximity of this craft because so many of them emit ionizing radiation, to the point that there was a federal firefighting manual chapter devoted specifically to the possible radiological effects of downed, crashed, malfunctioning alien craft. So it's well known even within federal firefighters that this is real. So they begin to get affected by the close proximity of the craft. They notice these aliens, for lack of a better term, carrying these human body parts and stuffing them into these square containers, taking them on board the craft. The Special Forces soldiers took the beings under fire. A firefight ensued. Long story short, first military intelligence debriefed them, and then they were drugged and debriefed later by civilians who, depending on the source, Lear says that they were directly from Majestic or elements of MJ-12 Magic, that they came there, debriefed the soldiers, drugged them, and instilled amnesia in order for them to forget about the incident. And we've seen this happen on a number of occasions. September 1977, I thoroughly debriefed John Vasquez, a good friend of mine in San Diego, who was one of the members of this infantry battalion in September 1977 when there was a mass alien abduction. He and a number of the people in his unit were drugged in the succeeding days by these civilians, these army psychiatrists that came along with their needles and injections. Similar thing happened to Rendlesham Forest. Some of the key witnesses, Larry Ward, who I've also had on my show, he was taken underground, drugged, and they tried to scramble his memory, et cetera, et cetera. So that's standard operational procedure for a lot of military people is, they're debriefed, threatened, intimidated, oftentimes given narco-hypnosis, selective memory erasure, and then often as not, if they still have time in their military contracts, the witnesses are just spread far and wide at different posts all over the world so they can't compare notes. So something like that happened with the SOG team in Cambodia. Memory started to come back. By the time 88 rolled around, they reached out and contacted Leonard Stringfield. And Leonard Stringfield recorded their story for posterity. Another quick point about Stringfield, and I wanted to talk a bit about Ted Rice in the few minutes we got left, and I would love to have you on my show, Al. Not many people realize it, but Leonard Stringfield was familiar with my labs because Leah Haley told me that she was told by Forrest Crawford, who I never met. I crossed paths with Forrest. I attended one of his lectures in Memphis, Tennessee, where I was also given a lecture. And Forrest Crawford was told by Leonard Stringfield that he'd investigated several cases where American women, my lab women, were gotten into a relationship by males who were ex-military, quote unquote, or active duty military intelligence spooks. And in a number of cases, what resulted from these relationships was that the women wind up dying of cancer or had an untimely demise, let's say. So Leonard Stringfield told this to Forrest Crawford, a veteran Midwest UFO researcher. And Forrest Crawford told this to Leah Haley. Leah Haley told it to me. So the late, great Leonard Stringfield himself was aware of military abductions. And one of the researchers that we really owe a lot of gratitude towards is the late, great Dr. Carla Turner, Candy to her friends, because she was one of the ones that first came out, and her second book, Taken, Inside the Alien Abduction Syndrome, features 8 different alien abductees. All of them had military abductions also. And so her books and her work, along with Leah's testimony and a number of other ones, Katarina Wilson came out around that time. One of my good friends, Diane Johnson, in the high desert of Southern California, had a lot of military experiences with the naval intelligence, with Air Force, and also with reptilians. So when we started having this body, this corpus of knowledge about my labs, and back then there was very much an us versus them mentality. We were outraged. We're American citizens. We're citizens in good standing. And the government, the military, in our naivete, we're thinking, well, they should be on our side. Instead, we're getting kidnapped, drugged, debriefed, tortured.
Right, right.
And then on top of that, they try to train us and utilize us as operational assets, right? So we're talking about exploitation, and also the things that have happened in my labs, with female my labs being gang raped by soldiers, deliberately being tortured, the things that have gone on in Dulce. I have no reason to believe that the accounts coming out of Dulce were anything other than real, because my mentor, Barbara Bartley, she had done hypnotic regression work with Krista Tilton, one of the first alien abductees, who described being taken to Dulce.
Dulce, yeah.
Yeah, and also I knew some people in the high desert of Southern California who knew personally Thomas Costello before Thomas Costello disappeared, presumably run down by the deep black military and murdered. Thomas Costello, if you're familiar with the story, he was a RAND security specialist at Section D, otherwise known as Dulce. He was responsible for the audio-visual CCTV cameras and all the various floors. And he escaped from Dulce. Unfortunately, his wife and his son were taken by the military into the base. He never heard from them again. He went on the run with a cache of videotapes and still photography. And he'd been on the run. And every 6 months, every year, he would send a message out to certain researchers, particularly in the Southern California high desert area, to let them know he was still alive, that he's still on the run. But after a while, and I talked to Bill Hamilton, who's no longer in the field, but Bill Hamilton was familiar with this. And I knew others that knew Thomas Costello personally. They said after a while, they just lost comms with him. Presumably, he was hunted down and killed by the controllers. And that goes back to, Thomas C's story goes back to the 70s, the late 1970s. We know that Pat Price, a remote viewer for Operation Stargate, Project Stargate rather, SRA, Stanford Research Institute, that whole remote viewing program, that he had inadvertently remotely viewed the underground base at Mount Hayes in Alaska, where he likewise saw humans and human military lab technicians, etc., working in unison with aliens. And then one fine day in Las Vegas, similar to what happened to Georgy Markov, this Soviet dissident in London, someone came alongside Pat Price, stuck him with some kind of a needle, and shortly thereafter he died in his hotel room. His death written off as murder. That was that. But he was in the employ of the government at the time, essentially for SRI and for the CIA. But they had no qualms getting rid of him because he didn't have a need to know. And so, one quick point, and I want to get to Ted Rice. To assassinate a sitting president, there has to be an extreme reason to do that, because all the presidents prior to JFK, going back at least as far as FDR, were read into the alien program. April 1941, Cape Girardeau, Missouri. We have documentation, the so-called Majestic documents, if you go to that website, where they have these documents that have been obtained, which shows FDR, General George Marshall, Vannevar Bush, others, they're discussing the crash retrieval and the examination of celestial devices, which in all likelihood was the referring to the Cape Girardeau experience. So that was FDR, certainly Truman, and there was a number of crash retrievals before Roswell, and certainly after Truman, you had Eisenhower, who apparently had, I have no reason to doubt this, I had Paul Blake Smith on my show. He's written books about Eisenhower's meeting with aliens. I'm satisfied that took place. Whether the treaty or treaties, more likely plural, occurred at the time of the Eisenhower meeting or shortly thereafter, or there had been ongoing interactions prior to that, at any rate, by the time the 60s and 70s roll around, this ongoing collusion between deep black elements of the military medical community and, for lack of a better term, aliens, or at any rate non-human life forms, had been going on a continual basis in some of these underground bases. And of course, Puerto Rico is ongoing. The great Puerto Rican investigator Jorge Martin, all the military activity related to ETs, et cetera, et cetera. And getting to Ted Rice really quick, I'm going to have Ted on my show. I got in contact with him shortly after he started coming out again and giving these lectures, and so I'm going to have him on my show, and hopefully we'll get a lot of stuff out and talk about Barbara's work, because Barbara was a pioneer in our field. To me, Barbara Bartley pushed the alien abduction information to great heights, and I don't see any other researcher to this day who has matched or exceeded what Barbara has done as far as getting down to minute details of various aspects of the hybridization agenda, the reptilian overlordship, the underground processing plants, et cetera, et cetera. Where Barbara lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was it probably still is, a reptilian base beneath Turley Mountain, where they have one of these processing plants. She'd also identified another processing plant beneath Yelm, Washington, and other places. So we're talking about an ongoing global phenomenon. And thankfully now David Politis has come out in the recent past with his book, Missing 411, The UFO Connection, which to me was absolutely key, because now we can start going in that direction. People need to plug into the great work of the Brazilian, South American investigators, as well as Bob Pratt, who did a lot of work about human mutilations and alien attacks against human villagers in South America, in Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. So
I would love to do this again because I'd really like to hash out not only Ted Rice, but also you mentioned earlier soul entrapment. So, I mean, I've been sort of slowly trying to weed my audience and educate them on what's going on. And they know about the physical farming, the energy farming now. But the soul entrapment is totally new. And you sort of slip that in. So you piqued everyone's interest, including mine. But unfortunately, I don't think we have time for that. I think that we need at least 20 minutes to hash that one out. And I know that Ted Rice was involved in that as well, or was aware of it or experienced it. I know that he does mention that in his video that I covered.
And also the cloning aspect, too. There's a huge cloning aspect directly tied in with the animal cow mutilations. So that's a whole other topic that Ted was involved in, that came up in Barbara's research with Krista Tilton. Leah Haley and I talked about this privately, about how cattle mutilation syndrome is directly related to the human hybrid, human cloning syndrome. So that's a whole other topic we can get into some other time.
Okay, James, do you want to do a shout out to let people know what you're about? And I know you have that awesome show that right now going on Cosmic Switchboard. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my website is called thecosmicswitchboard.com, and you can also find me on YouTube, and you can find me on Facebook as well as Twitter, so or X or whatever they're calling it now. And I'd love to hear from your listeners and those who have had alien encounters. I'd love to hear from you. And I myself have had experiences, and I network with a great number of people that have had similar experiences, MyLab experiences. I'm going to be interviewing a MyLab tonight for my show. So, if anyone feels so inclined, please go out to my website and check it out, thecosmicswitchboard.com. I've got 5+ years there of of archived material, and a lot of the members segment stuff is pretty hardcore. I think they would get a lot out of that too.
Hey, folks, this is Al Barrows with the awesome pioneer in ufology, James Bartley. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hopefully, we'll see James Bartley again on this show. I'm sending out all the love and good intentions. Please pray and send out a shield of protection for all the children in Gaza and the Ukraine. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to my podcast.